Cave, which is, of course, Latin for Achtung, Achtung. That's right. Or KV for poor boys in preparatory schools still in their shorts. Thanks to Tim Johnson for offering us a dead language for consideration. Bravo. Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk, the podcast in the front line of the world's response to the coronavirus. That's right. We are the COVID-19 boredom crew. We are here to alleviate those longers that occur between breakfast and when you would have got to work, when you're just basically walking across a room as your daily commute. Anyway, we've metaphorically hurled ourselves out of the plane over the burning bridge that is modern society. While other history podcasts are dithering over the Grosbeak heights, We Have Ways of Making You Talk is fighting for the bridge at Nijmegen on day one, holding on against the virus equivalent of the 9th SS Panzer Division. So, for it's under-equipped, it's been written down and doesn't actually have the equipment people seem to think it does. For the past 9 days, we've been badgering you, morning, noon and night. 9 days, that's how long it took to wipe out the British 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem. Are we defeated? No, we are not. We've established our own beachhead on the podcasting equivalent of the north side of the Neder Rhine. And no, we will not swim back across the river in the dead of night. We're here to stay, ladies and gentlemen. Why am I going on and on about this? Well, many of you, of course, have been listening to Zeno's magnificent novel, The Cauldron. I've finished it. It's all in the can, as we say, in show business. I've got to tell you, it gets grimmer and grimmer for the Pathfinder Company day by day. So I hope you're enjoying it. It's great to read. It's nice to read a novel that actually reads out loud well. James, what are you up to? Sicily, I expect?
Yeah, cracking on with that. And actually, I've just been doing the epic battle of the Primasoli Bridge, which also involved airborne troops having a really rubbish time.
Alistair Pearson.
Yeah.
The great Alistair Pearson.
Yeah, well, he's one of my characters in the book. So, yeah, following him. And what a shower that was. And it's just horrendous because, of course, it's absolutely baking hot. You know, there's mozzies galore, there's flies and maggots galore. Everyone's dying. And the moment they die, they start swelling up and going black in the heat.
Now, am I right in thinking...
The stench is terrible and it's absolutely brutal and it's close quarter stuff and lots of people are dying. Now,
people don't... Primasoli Bridge isn't it's one of the airborne battles that I don't think is on people's radar necessarily.
Yeah.
It's basically, they're sent in to hold a bridge, right? Stop me if you've heard this one before. They're parachuted in to hold a bridge with an with a drop zone scheme that doesn't really make any sense when you look at where the bridges and where the drop zones are. Stop me if you've heard this one before. With Gerald Lathbury herring around and ending up in the wrong place. Look, forgive me if this sounds familiar. And then Montgomery's land forces being late. I mean,
it's just amazing. Okay, so first of all, you have the glider plan on D-Day, where they go in and have to attack the Ponte Grande, and it's just an absolute shower. So out of 144 gliders which are supposed to take off, 4 land on their designating landing zone. 4 out of 144. Not the greatest.
It's a wonder weapon. It's a wonder weapon, James, I tell you. The
so
glider
that's that one.
A game-changing wonder weapon.
Meanwhile, the SRS, led by Paddy Mayne, renamed from 1 SAS temporarily. They go back to 1 SAS again. They come in by boat. They have 1 person killed and 3 wounded in 3 days of operations, and they do achieve absolutely everything that they're supposed to achieve just like that. Later on, there's another bridge at Augusta, which is just up the road from Syracuse that they're supposed to attack, and that get cancelled. And then the next one is the Primasoli Bridge, and there's another bridge called the Malati Bridge. So the Primasoli Bridge is the key one because 3 roads running north all converge at this point and get across the Catania Plain. The thing about the Catania Plain is there's 3 river courses going through it, and they all merge just before the Primasoli Bridge into one river, the River Someto. So this is why it's so key. So the whole idea is to send in the guys before, and then the infantry and armour come up before, and of course they're just a little bit late and all the rest of it. And unbeknown to them, it would have all been absolutely fine had it not been for the fact that the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division start being dropped in at the the time.
Yes, so this is a moment where you have simultaneous airborne operations going on.
Yes.
But the British and the Germans are dropping paratroopers in.
Yeah.
And so it's a complete cat's cradle of confusion.
Yes, and of course, and as it gets dark, what you've got is the Fallschirmjäger lid and the British airborne lid look exactly the same. certainly in the darkness. They've
Yep.
both got smocks on.
Yep.
British are slightly shorter one than the Germans
Yep.
ones. So they all look, so no one knows who sees. They're all firing at each other. But there is another bridge which has to be attacked, which is a bit further south from the Primosoli Bridge, which is the Malati Bridge, which is attacked by the commandos, number 3 Commando. And led by the same guy who's been one of the main guys in the Dieppe raid and got back. And Durnford Slater. And they land by boat, march 6 miles, take the bridge, hold it all day, and do get sort of counterattack quite badly and take a few casualties. But again, it is all their forces reach their objective. Whereas out of 1,856, only 200 alive at Primosoli Bridge.
Are you saying that maybe airborne forces are a waste of resources and possibly not the right way to go about this sort of thing, James?
Well, I'll tell you what I am suggesting is that it might have solved a whole load of bother if they hadn't bothered dropping them out of airplanes and just delivered them by boat in Sicily.
So what you are saying here, I mean, because after all, airborne forces are they're doctrinally created because they create this thing in reaction to the Germans using Fallschirmjäger and glider troops and Luftwaffe soldiers basically in May of 1940. That we've got to have some paratroopers, and then they think, well, what do we do? And they develop doctrinally as to protect your flanks for a marine landing, for an amphibious landing. That's what they end up doing. And D-Day is where they do it. 6th Airborne is created for that task, for that role, doctrinally, trained and planned and all that sort of thing, and they practice and they rehearse and then they do the things that they're planning to do. But it's pretty interesting, isn't it? Because in Italy it really doesn't work. It doesn't work at all.
No.
And you could see someone saying, you know what, we need to sack this off. It's pointless. It doesn't.
And also, Al, you've got all these amazingly trained, motivated troops who are completely gung ho and go, okay, let's just look at this. We've got these fantastic troops. They're brilliant. Let's use them, but let's use them a little bit more judiciously. Let's have a look at what the SRS did and what the commandos did in Sicily. Yeah. That's a massive tick, whichever way you look at it. Maybe this whole kind of airborne bit is the bit that doesn't really work, and that's the problem. It's that square peg round hole that they never really sort out, that you've got the best trained troops being delivered by the least trained aircrew.
And then you've got an ongoing problem of the fact that you've got all these motivated soldiers leaving regular units. So if you're the DLI or whatever, and your good NCOs sign up to be paratroopers or airborne soldiers and leave, you're basically the knock-on effect runs across the whole of the army's infrastructure, actually, by creating these elite forces. And if you're basically not, the really interesting thing is there's this constant, and certainly until early 1944, there's this constant to and fro with the RAF going, no, you can't have any planes. Yeah. No, we're not giving you any planes. No, sorry, we don't rate this as a priority at all. All right, you can have some obsolete bombers. So what? We don't care that they're lousy parachute aircraft. And Harris obviously going. Harris saying, well, we've only got one job, thanks very much, and that's destroying German cities and killing the man who makes the rifle, which is more important than the bloke with the rifle
when it gets there,
but blah, 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 blah. Right, so you have this very odd thing. And arguably, you look at what happens in Sicily in 1944, in 1943 rather, you could sack off airborne forces after that and go, you know what, this doesn't work. We're wasting time, we're wasting money, we're wasting aircrew, we're wasting resources.
Yep.
But it kind of shows. I mean, airborne forces is how I got interested in the Second World War, full stop, because of my father. Taking me to Arnhem and brainwashing me when I was 15 about the glorious last stand, blah blah blah. But the interesting thing is there is this push me pulley, but it shows actually how successful Browning was as a networker, as a schmoozer, as a political soldier, like managing to get Brooke's ear and Churchill's ear probably, most likely, and managing to get the money spent and the aircraft diverted. Because after Sicily, you'd be within your rights to go, you know what, forget it. We're better off landing a load of commandos at night and they leg it to to Pegasus Bridge.
Well, I think there's some really interesting thoughts there, and one of them is that the follow-up brigade that comes to relieve the paras, the Red Berets at Primosoli Bridge, is the Durham Brigade, and we were talking about the Durhams the other day. So 3 battalions of Durhams, the 6th, 8th, and 9th. And they get thrown in and they get absolutely slaughtered. I mean, they perform amazingly. They perform really, really well and win the day. They win it from experienced Fallschirmjäger who've been on the Eastern Front. So they're not up against second-tier Germans. These are your elites that everyone always goes on about. Your highly motivated elites. And they win that battle. Now, okay, they're supported by fire support as well, but they're still having to do the hard yards, and they perform every bit as well as the Red Berets do. And one of the reasons they do is because they've got unit cohesion, because they know their platoon commanders and their section leaders and their company commanders. They're operating as one. They've been together, they've trained together, they fought together. And so the problem with the airborne drop, because only 200, only sort of 16% of those dropped actually fight in the airborne brigade, actually fight at Primosoli Bridge, you have lots of troops which are cobbled together. Now, to a certain extent, their training and their ability to use their initiative and all the rest of it makes up for it. But what you don't have is lots of airborne units fighting in the units of which they have trained and designed to operate.
But also, I mean, a thing Urquhart writes about in his book about Arnhem is he says one of the disadvantages you have with airborne soldiers is that you're suddenly in a battlefield. What doesn't happen is you come up through the lines and you get closer, and then you're rotated and all that sort of standard stuff that regular soldiers, regular line infantry, because they're, let's face it, they're essentially the sharp end is the infantry part of the. He says basically one of your problems is people are suddenly plonked in a battlefield, and they've not been acclimatized, and he regarded that as a real proper problem. With First Airborne when it was under his command, and so what you've got is which underlines your point. You've got disintegrated units essentially.
Yes.
Because the mode of delivery is so unreliable. And haphazard necessarily, right? And then of course in Normandy that gets turned into the 101st and 82nd caused such chaos by landing in all over the place that the chaos was a virtue in itself. Is how that gets sort of digested. But basically you've got these units that train together and they're, like you say, are disintegrated, but also plonked in a battlefield suddenly, rather than this thing of being brought through the line like conventional troops. And so and this isn't, and again, this isn't to criticise anyone. This is the complexity of delivering men out of nowhere into a battlefield, rather than like you say, the Durhams who fought together, trained together, extremely experienced and hard-nosed infantry brigade. And with all sorts of with like you say, cohesion. Although if I remember rightly, it's Pearson leads the bayonet charge at Primosoli. To finally kick the Germans off the bridge again, doesn't he? Am I right?
No, he doesn't. No, it's.
I read that he did, but I probably read that in an airborne history book.
No, he doesn't. But he performs brilliantly there. He's really, really good. I mean, it's an amazing. I mean, there's fantastic descriptions of kind of slipping down into the River Someto to ford it, just a little a couple of 400 yards away from the bridge, and it's night time and it's dark, and they come in at sort of infiltration, and all they can hear is the kind of sort of the croaking of the frogs and the bulrushes, and hear the mosquitoes dive bombing them in their ears and stuff. And they're slipping across, and they can smell this absolutely appalling stench of rotting bodies mingled with kind of sort of lemons and oranges and cordite and all the rest of it. I mean, it's incredibly atmospheric. But it is interesting, this whole, because what you do have is this incredible force. Within a conscript army, you've got a number of troops, whether they be the SAS, whether they be the Rangers, whether they be the Commandos, whether they be US and British and Canadian airborne forces. You've got these troops who are gung-ho, who are really trained, who want to be good, want to be the best, who are highly motivated, that you could just use better. I mean, just as for example this, I mean, I played devil's advocate here, but in Normandy, just imagine you landed a whole load of airborne troops north of Utah Beach on a quiet section of the coast, which is that there are quiet sections there, and you just send them on a route march straight to their objectives. They're all together. They could take that would be no problem at all. Marching 10 miles at night if you know where you're going isn't a problem.
Yeah.
It's a problem. The problem comes if you don't know where you are in your start point. The problem, of course, is that they don't have enough shipping. But if you're creating fewer transport aircraft, you could then maybe divert some of that industry and effort that you're making C-47s to making more landing craft. I don't know. But, I mean, it is interesting, isn't it, that no one at any point does exactly what you're suggesting, which is go, hang on a minute here. We've got these great lads. Let's keep the highly motivated troop elite bit, but let's kind of chuck in the towel with the drop bit.
But I remember in the late 70s when my dad's airborne sapper unit was turned into commandos and he had to take his red beret off and was told he was going to have to wear a green one. Just imagine how that went.
Well, so they could still wear a red one. They could still wear a red one, but they could just be a different elite force, couldn't they? You've got the commandos.
No, but it's really, I mean, it's really, really interesting all this because nowadays, I remember talking to Gary Sheffield about this, who'd spoken to someone about a contemporary soldier about how do you do Pegasus Bridge now?
Yeah,
and they said, well, you can't put a company of infantry onto it. We haven't got the people.
Yeah.
So what you'd probably do is it would be 4 blokes who would halo in whatever and shoot cut everyone at the bridge's throats.
Yeah.
And you do it that way. You do it because there aren't the people, and you don't spend 4 helicopters on it, which is what the equivalent would be.
Yeah.
Because after all, that's what replaces the glider is the helicopter.
Yeah, of course.
It's so interesting, though. I mean, because the glamour of the airborne must be a big part of why they survived as a tactical solution.
But also because of the ear they've got at the highest corridor, the highest
exactly,
power.
exactly.
But I've been, I've also with the Sicily stuff, I've been rereading by Ernie Pyle, who you may know that I'm a big fan of. And you may also remember, Al, that I like to talk about the operational level once in a blue moon.
Yes.
Okay.
Drink. If you're playing the game, drink now.
Check this. Okay, so this is a few days after. This is some days after D-Day. He's on the American sector. Yep. He comes ashore at Licata, which is a port, a small, very small port on the southern coast of Sicily. And he's just marvelling at the kind of 1 minute the sea is empty. He goes into his cabin, comes back out again. It's completely black with ships, and huge freighters have arrived, and landing craft are beetling around. Pontoons have already been steel pontoons have been set up on the beach. The whole thing is just running like clockwork. Yeah. And I've just got to read this because it's just absolutely brilliant. He goes, "Sometimes it seemed as if half the men of America were there, all working madly together. Suddenly I realised what all this was. It was America's long-awaited power of production finally rolling into the far places where it had to go to end the war. It sounds trite when it's put into words, but the might of material can overwhelm everything before it. We saw that in the last days of Tunisia. We saw it again there in Sicily. The point was that we on the scene knew for sure that we could substitute machines for lives, and that if we could plague and smother the enemy with an unbearable weight of machinery, in the months to follow, hundreds of thousands of our young men, whose expectancy of survival would otherwise have been small, could someday walk again through their own front doors."
There you go.
There you go.
The machine.
I looked at that and I was very happy.
Metal, not flesh.
Steel, not flesh. Yeah, exactly.
Very strong. Steel, not flesh. Well, we need on that rousing paean to material predominance on the operational level. We need to take a break. By the way, we're 1 year old this week on this podcast, aren't we? We're 1 year old.
Amazing.
It's an exciting thing. We'll take a break. We'll see you after the break with some of your questions, I think. Welcome back to this edition of We Have Ways of Making You Talk, the Second World War podcast with me, Al Murray, and actual historian James Holland. James and I were talking about Sicily then because we were supposed to talk about something else. That's how this podcast works.
We went completely off what we were supposed to, wouldn't we?
Yeah. I'm going to have to go back to some of those books about airborne at Sicily because it's.
Well, you're going to be able to read mine soon.
Well, of course I am. Of course I'm going to be able to read yours soon. But I've also found the first book first history book my dad. I told you I was brainwashed about airborne forces. So I found this first book I was ever given by a man called Barry Gregory, British Airborne Troops, a MacDonald Illustrated War Studies book.
Yeah, it just looks amazing.
My nickname when I was a kid was Buzz. So it says, to Buzz with lots of love from Dad. And it's a guy who was in the Artist Rifles, actually, funny enough, that wrote this.
Just show up the cover again. I love that cover.
It's full of.
I've just got to get.
It's full of maps and a sort of matter of fact, gritty tales, and there's some really interesting photos of the mock-ups of Whitleys in hangars and discussion of how they developed all the early parachuting techniques when they wore that sort of donut instead of a helmet. Anyway,
I've got it. Here it is on Amazon. Hardcover from £2.33. Currently unavailable. What?
I have the only copy in the country.
No, you haven't. I've got it. I bought it from.
Oh, balls.
Got it. Done.
It's great fun.
I won't get it till April the 25th, but
I know we're not getting anything till April the 25th. Right,
no, exactly.
So before we go any further, can I just thank you all for sticking with us through the first year of our campaign? We're 1 year old this week. And also, welcome to all the new listeners, because I did some blatant plugging on the one show last week, and our producer described me as podcast Viagra. The curve went boing like that. Up it went. So welcome everyone who's not listened before. There's a year of this baloney, so if you want to work your way back through it,
you'll be most welcome, wouldn't you?
It's tinned and it's fresh, and it's there waiting for you to delve into. Thanks for all your messages and questions and corrections and general fascination with the subject we both love. I have to say, there's one contributor on Twitter, a guy who calls himself Ernest Malley, who's
brilliant, isn't he?
Always sending us Australian stuff, and it's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah,
and he really knows his onions, and he's
got a picture of Orson Welles, doesn't he?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And he had that really interesting footage of a 2-pounder being used in, obsolete 2-pounder being used in 1945 in the jungle, where the Australian militia troops had figured out what they needed to do was fire at the trees and shatter the trees, and that was the way of getting the Japanese out of their positions, because the trees would explode. And good stuff though. We love that kind of contribution.
We do, and it just reminds me that. Okay, so I've just got to say this. I know I'm going off piste again, but a few years ago, Dan Snow and I were sort of thinking, we get asked a lot to do interviews and stuff with people. You just the best one in the world. You just can't sort of drop of a hat go up to kind of Ayrshire or something. So we set up this thing called War Generation. Yeah. To get volunteers to, if you knew of a Second World War veteran, go and interview him. And put up sort of guidelines and all the rest of it. And it all needs a bit of help. And it's basically been steered by this amazing guy called Shane Greer, who's just the loveliest bloke. And he's up in Scotland, somewhere near Inverness. Yeah. And he sort of coordinates it all. And I really think we should try and sort of get that a bit better organised and try and create a hub for stuff, for photos.
Well, why don't we talk to him, and we'll get him on here and talk to him about it as well? Because
they've got some amazing interviews now. I mean, if people haven't seen it, you should have a look at it. It's called wargen.org, I think. And there's loads of interviews up there, and they're fantastic. And it's such a good resource, and it just needs organising.
Brilliant. Excellent. Right, now, we have questions, a ton of questions by email for the elderly and Twitter this week. What shall I ask a question, James? Let me ask you a question that was sent to us by Port en Bessin 47, who asks, did German special forces raid the mainland of Britain at all? There is a rumour some Brandenburgers got onto the Isle of Wight. Have either of you ever investigated, or can you shed any light? I reckon this is a one-word answer.
No.
There we are.
I don't think they got onto the Isle of Wight. It's not quite a one-word answer, because some forces did land in East Anglia somewhere, and they got arrested immediately. I mean, the amazing thing about German infiltration of Britain is that not one agent ever successfully did so.
Yeah. Well, there's the guy who was the last treason trial, wasn't it, in the Tower of London, who was the German agent who basically landed and then walked into a pub and tried to make a phone call. And they're all like, well, he sounds German, doesn't he?
Yes. Yeah.
Hello?
Please, could you put me through to Berlin 231?
I have to speak to my controller.
My commandant! And it just sort of didn't quite work.
Yeah. So in basically Porto Besta 47, no. James says no. It would be interesting to...
Because people always talk about, but they always talk about sort of, and he spoke with flawless English. And you go, no, he didn't. He was German. It's just not possible.
Okay. So GHFS asks... The podcast, well, first of all, states the podcast is truly brilliant, chaps. Well, look, I mean, what can you do? We're just trying here. I was wondering, was there a system for naming all the different operations during the war? Rather like we name storms today, or was it down to personal choice?
I think they had a sort of book, didn't they? They had a sort of booklet of names, and they decided to go for fish, didn't they, for the British beaches in Normandy, for example. But Churchill vetoed jelly. He said, "I'm not going to have anyone losing their life on a beach called jelly." Yeah. So they changed it to Juno. Bomber Command tended to give their operations sort of portentous names. So you have, Gomorrah in Hamburg. And sometimes they have a flavour, but it's the flavour of the book rather than there was a book, and they would just churn through them. And at one point in Normandy, it looked like whoever was doing Second Army Group's planning or Second Army's planning was really into race courses. So you get Epsom, Charnwood, Goodwood, and so on. I mean, but then the pattern's ruined by the pattern is ruined by Blue Coat. Yeah, I mean that's not a race course, is it? No, and they must have started again and Totalise and Blackcock, and I mean I'm reading about Veritable and which leads up to Varsity, so it looks like they're on the V's by that point. You've got the last series of battles before they cross the Rhine. Have all got these Grenade, and there's Grenade as well. And Operation Gatwick was Montgomery's scheme, post Market Garden scheme, that eventually he kind of actually did run through via Varsity and Veritable and Blackcock and all that. But yeah, they're just picked out of a hat. Basically, there was a book. I mean, there are so many names, and there's so many. Everything gets an operational name, and of course, lots of them are very, very small things which disappear and you kind of don't know, you never hear anything more about. And some of them get changed, of course, because there was Anvil, which was the invasion of southern France, and then it became Dragoon. And Dracula, which is the invasion of Rangoon, wasn't it? Yes, indeed, yeah. But they're just it's just a book. And Market Garden, of course, which is two words. Yeah, well, there's two elements. There's two elements, is Market and Garden, yeah. Anyway, it's basically out of a book. But that's a good question, because they're these operation names, they become famous, some of them, and yet they are. It's not like Operation Desert Storm, Operation Righteous Freedom, or any of that kind of. I think wasn't Desert Storm in the British Army, it was called Granby or something like. No, we're not calling it that. We're not calling it that. Thanks. And then Telek as well. You're like, no, we're not calling it. Telek and Herrick, yeah, we're not calling it resounding freedom. Operation. And we were talking about the airborne operations in Sicily. Operation Ladbroke was the operation for the Ponte Grandi bridge. Let me just check with Barry Gregory. Yeah. And then it was Operation Fustian, which I think is a brilliant name. Yeah. Was the Primasoli. It's Fustian's Primasoli. Yeah. Which after all is just if you want to know what went wrong at Arnhem, look at what happened to Primasoli at Fustian. Part of the course. Anyway, right, next question. Yes. Ian Strong got in touch to say, cracking pod chaps, don't know much about my granddad's war. He never talked about it ever. I do know he spent some time in Iraq. What was happening in that part of the Middle East? Yeah, well, that's a really interesting one. I mean, Iraq really sort of comes to the fore in the early part of 1941. Yeah. So there's lots going on in the Middle East in that period, both in Iran and, of course, in Syria. There's a war in Syria where the British, and largely Australians, I should add, the Australians capture Aleppo, for example. The British and the Australians are attacking with the Free French against the Vichy French, secure that in July 1941. But before that is the rebellion in Iraq, because Iraq is British protectorate, part of British interests in the Middle East. And it is... there is a king who is Faisal II, who is a nipper. And so there is a regent who is his uncle, and he's the Emir Abdul Ilah. And there is a coup by the former prime minister who's called Rashid Ali al-Gilani. And al-Gilani organises this coup in early part of April 1941. And it's all a bit of a problem because, of course, all British resources are kind of tied up in April they're in Greece, and they're also in North Africa and in Libya, and they haven't really got many resources. And Churchill goes, well, this is absolutely intolerable. It is sort of Al-Gilani is given nominal backing by Germany. They send over a few Luftwaffe planes, and actually the rebels then promptly shoot down the son of Field Marshal Blomberg as he's coming down. So they don't win too many points on that one. But Churchill then goes to Wavell and Auckland and says, look, what can you do about this? And Wavell goes, well, we haven't really got anything. And Wavell goes, well, yeah, no, we've got something. So he sends over a brigade of the 10th Indian Division, who then land at Basra. Meanwhile, there is RAF Habanaya, which Al-Gilani's men, his rebels, try and take and capture, because, capture the airfield. And there is, that's RAF Iraq is commanded by a chap called Air Vice Marshal Harry Smart. And he's got about 1,000 ground crew, air crew and stuff operating at RAF Habanaya. And he gets them together, and he also rounds up 1,200 Iraqi and Assyrian levies, and the rebels attack, and they hold them off. They see them off completely, and they give them a bloody nose. And meanwhile, the Indians have landed at Basra and march up and capture Fallujah. So it's all the same old places. At the very end of, basically it's all over by the kind of about 19th of May. I think Fallujah falls on the 19th of May, 1941. And then Al-Gilani then flees to Iran. And there's another sort of insurrection in Iran, which is promptly squashed as well. So then he flees to Italy. And later on in the war, he does actually get an audience with Hitler, interestingly enough. But that's the end of it. And thereafter is no more problem. But one of the people that cut their teeth and later on in Iran, of course, is Slim. Having done his stint in East Africa.
And then what happens in Persia? Because it's not. I mean, after all, we're talking about Iran here. There's no such place. Persia. Then when Barbarossa happens, the Soviets step in, and there's a sort of co-occupation of Persia by the British and the Indian army, using the Indian army, but by the Russians and the British to keep the lid on that, because it's just too oil-wise. The whole region is just too important to let it fall either into insurrection or.
It's the plus one minus one thing. So if Germany gets to the Middle East, not only do they deny oil to us, they gain the oil themselves. And the whole problem, of course, is that Germany doesn't have any oil apart from what they get from Ploesti in Romania. So it's very important. In fact, actually, the oil in the Middle East, everyone always sort of assumes it's absolutely vital for British war effort. It isn't. It's vital for maintaining the war effort in the Middle East, but it doesn't supply any British oil. Britain gets all its wartime oil from Venezuela and from the USA, who are the two leading oil producers in the world in the 1940s. So the Middle East is comparatively small beer. But it's very important that the Germans don't get their hands on it. It's kind of more important than us losing it in a way. Because
it's not until the very end of the war that the Saudis, for instance, are buttered up by the Americans, and their oil starts heading in America's direction. I mean, that's all post-war. Right. And our oil picture, the way we view the world in terms of oil, is essentially wrong. And it's one of those examples of when people look at Germany now and go, the Germans are brilliant and efficient and all that sort of thing, and then they back project it onto Nazi Germany. That's one of those anachronistic ways of looking at
exactly that
global picture that you can get wrong. And the oil picture is very because the oil's needed basically for because we lose Burmese oil. It's needed for the effort out of India into Burma, basically, isn't it? And to keep that going rather than out the British home front or the war in Western Europe or whatever. The Middle Eastern oil fields aren't online the way they are now at this point in history.
Not. But what is also really interesting is a lot of that there's quite a lot of activity going on in the Middle East in 1941. And 1941 is always seen as this kind of sort of dark year for Britain. And I think that's completely dictated by, failure in Greece, loss of Crete, being kicked back in the desert. Rather than any kind of real wider knowledge, because actually, as we've talked about before, in the Battle of the Atlantic, actually, we get to a point by May 1941 where we're no longer going to lose the Battle of the Atlantic. It's still very serious, but we're definitely, the tide has turned there. So that's a massive tick, because the Battle of the Atlantic is, I think, one can argue and argue convincingly, the most important theatre in the whole of the Second World War. And then you've got the Middle East, which is
campaign,
Yeah, and that's sort, and then you've got the whole of East Africa, which is works in our favour. Then you've got the whole clearing up of Iraq and Iran and Syria and all that sort of stuff, all of which are not massive operations but are significant operations. And actually coming on Syria is really important because it comes on the back of the fall of Crete. So Crete falls at the end of May 1941, a month before the Germans invade the Soviet Union, and you can argue that is, the people who come out best out of Crete actually is the British rather than the Germans, because the losses that the Germans suffer in Crete is absolutely enormous. And it comes and it involves a huge diversion of resources just at a point where they absolutely can't afford it.
Yeah, it's entirely.
And they lose. Not only do they lose lots of Fallschirmjäger, they also lose lots of transport planes.
Yeah, it's entirely Pyrrhic. Yeah.
Exactly. And then in July, we then capture key airfields in Syria, which we are then able to use for the rest of the war. And Alexandria and Egypt are equidistant between those airfields in Crete and those airfields that we've just been captured in Syria. So, as an offensive air base for the Germans, Crete is neutralised by those gains that the British make in the summer of 1941.
Yeah. There we go.
So it's actually quite important. So there you go.
It's very important, Ian, and that's. I hope that's helped answer your question about your granddad's war. Now, Jermaine got in touch with this. Love the show. For the ladies, what impact did the female workforce have on the services? Did it have an impact on the male servicemen when the ladies were also conscripted? Thanks, chaps, from one of the lady listeners.
Yeah, it did, and it's one of those. Again, it's one of those sort of great revolutions that takes place in the war, where everything just gets turned on its head, and actually the Subscription Act number 2, which gets passed in December 1941, sees conscription for women. Now, to start off with, it's only aged 20 to 30 single or childless widows that are eligible to be conscripted, and that's then raised up to the age of 37. And the people are encouraged to volunteer from about, I think it's April 1941. In total, it's just under half a million women serve in the armed forces, 467,000 in actual fact. So it's a good number. But to start off with, there's all sorts of problems, because you can when you get conscripted, then you have a choice as whether you want to go into one of the armed services, the ATS or something like that, or a REN, or as a WAF in the Air Force, or to do civilian or industry work or whatever. Yeah, or coastal defence or whatever. So you can choose. And if you're going to be in the combat zone, such as an anti-aircraft battery working on searchlights or something like that, then again you have to volunteer to that. You're not going to be conscripted to be in the front line. But of course, a lot of the places where women get involved are on the land, but also in industry. And where most of the industrial heartland is in the Midlands and in the Northeast and stuff. And that involves a lot of movement of people. So you've got this huge logistical headache of where do you get all these women from? And you then have to move them, and you have to find them digs, and you have to get them there, and you have to feed them, because there aren't enough women in that category in those areas. So there's a lot of mobility going on as well, which is completely changing the whole fabric of society. So it's really, really interesting. But no competence as such no women competence as such.
Yes, it's not like the Soviets, where there are women fighting units and all that sort of thing.
Yeah,
I mean the thing with the Second World War, and we talked about this the other day about the parallels that can be drawn with what's happening now, and there are many, but there are also arguably none, because our society is so completely different. The actual parallel is the totality of involvement for the population. So.
Yes.
What the big changes?
Exactly that.
The big changes in the workplace for women. That obviously you get this because men are conscripted, because men need to go to work. You then get a squeeze on needing to fill factory places. Women needed for important war work, and a lot of it's a repeat of the First World War. When you had when you had munitions factories that were basically essentially all women, and women living together in kind of barracks working on those factories and just living their lives doing that. And so you get some stuff that happens in the First World War, but obviously attitudes are 20 years later. They've got people a different view of war and what it should involve. And then you have the Blitz, so the notion that the population is actually on the receiving end rather than simply sending an army somewhere to fight. It's the totality of it, and that I think that's really interesting. And obviously, women have more money to spend suddenly, and all this sort of thing. That goes through society, and as ever, what we've done is drifted a little from the question, because I don't know that it had an impact on male servicemen when women were conscripted, but conscription was an incredibly contentious thing politically, the thing politicians really finger crept towards and didn't want to do, and in most of the dominions didn't. So they couldn't do it in Canada, even though they were running out of people. For instance, towards the end of the war, there was a major political crisis about conscription in Canada, for instance. It's fascinating, and then you've also got this thing of women, for instance, the air auxiliary, delivering Spitfires and Lancasters and all this sort of stuff. Why can't women fight? Why can't they be fight? Why can't they be fighter pilots? Why can't they be bomber pilots? And that was never going to happen in Britain. Happened in the Soviet Union. I mean, like I said a moment ago.
Yeah, and women did put themselves on the front line. I mean, obviously you're in the front line because you're being bombed, and so the front line comes to the homes and all the rest of it. But they were putting on themselves on the front line as well. I mean, there were a number of ATS auxiliary pilots who got killed in accidents. And I remember Keith Miller, the cricketer. He witnesses a female pilot coming in with a Lancaster, and it crashes and explodes. And that's the end of her. Yeah. And then, of course, there's Daphne Pearson. And that's one of my favourite paintings of all time from the Second World War by Dame Laura Knight. It's a very, very famous picture because she wins the GC, the George Cross. She's a corporal in the RAF, and an RAF Anson crash lands, and she and a bomb that it's carrying explodes. And the plane's on fire, and she runs up to it, clambers into the burning fuselage, gets the pilot out, runs with him. The whole thing explodes when they're, 30 yards
just
from
clear
the
of it,
plane. And she dives on top of the pilot to protect him. I mean, it's just unbelievable. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, she should have got the VC, but she gets the GC, which is, I suppose.
Well, civilian, isn't she? So I suppose. Anyway. So
no, she's not. She's a WAF.
She's a WAF, right? All right. Well, yeah. Then she's been sorely robbed. Well, I think that's enough for today. We
probably
pretty much stayed on subject. James, well done.
Well, I've fitted a little bit, as always.
We're going to be. By the way, this is another chapter of the Zeno's The Cauldron Each Day, in which the author heavily editorialises about what went wrong with Operation Market Garden, and has people standing crouched in cellars arguing about tactical and operational misgivings that they had all along. I mean, that's a book. It's a fantastic read. It's laced with hindsight, though, you could argue. Now, what we're going to try to do, and we're grappling with the technology at the moment, dear listeners, try and do a thing where you can watch us talk to each other from our offices and send us questions while we're doing it. We're trying to get the tech straight. There will be an announcement on our Twitter feed at We Have Ways Pod, which will let you know that we're attempting this live thing. What I don't want to do is say now when we're going to do it, in case we can't get the technology right, because the last thing we want to do is dangle you such an enticing sweetmeat and then have to deny you it.
But that's the plan, isn't it? And we're hopefully going to be doing that once a week.
Yeah. And we're lining up another book for me to read once Zeno has... I can't tell you what happens at the end of that. It can constitute a spoiler to tell you what happened at the end of the Battle of Arnhem. Anyway, it's been a pleasure as ever. Nice talking to you, James. See you soon. Cheerio.
Yeah. Cheers. Cheerio, everyone.